Hi, I'm Ilan Berman. I'm Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council. It's a think tank in Washington, D.C. We spend a lot of time working on Russia, China, and transnational threats. I oversee all of our institutional research, but in my free time, such as it is, I do a lot of work on Islamic extremism, on Russia, and on Iran, which used to be three separate things. They are now all one thing, which is, I don't know, 50 miles north of here, right? So, I was struck by, so first, I'm a recovering lawyer. So it's a lifelong process. We have jackets. But it compels me to tell everybody, like I do every year when I come here, that what you're going to hear is not the official opinion of the agencies that I've consulted for, and I've consulted for several in the U.S. government. But I do spend a lot of time working with various parts of the executive branch and a lot of time in Congress. So hopefully what you'll hear is a relatively informed outsider's perspective. The second is that I know at least some of you are familiar with or have been in the U.S. military. I do not have my Ranger wings in PowerPoint. For those of you that have ever sat through Pentagon briefings, there are planes flying in from the right and ships coming in from the left, and it's really fantastic. That's not what you're going to see. I'm an absent-minded professor. What you're going to see is essentially benchmarks that I'm happy to elaborate on, and I'm happy to have you ask me questions about. And the third is that I'm actually ecstatic that I decided, before I was asked to be the moderator, when I was asked just to be a presenter, that I wanted to talk about Iran and cyberspace. Not Iranian cyber terrorism, but Iran and cyberspace, because at least in my navigation of the ICT conference for the last 3.5 days, I've heard virtually no mention of Iran and cyberspace. We've had a lot of discussions about cyber. We've had a lot of discussions about cyber terrorism. But what Iran is doing, what their strategy is, what they're trying to accomplish, and what their capabilities are, is really something that, while it's known to the Israeli government, certainly, and to a lesser extent to the U.S. government, it's not something that's publicly discussed. So let me try to shed a little bit of light, if I can, here. I'll do my best. So, okay, so the first orienting point is that Iran is a maturing cyber threat. Up until about 7 years ago, the U.S. intelligence community would talk about the big two. They would talk about, in terms of cyber threats, they would talk about Russia and they would talk about China. And they would talk about them in different fashions. When you think about China, you think about China in the context of intellectual property theft. The former director of national intelligence famously said that as of 2016, China had stolen the equivalent of 7 libraries of Congress worth of intellectual property from the United States. And by the way, it does it because it can, because we haven't actually, we, the United States, have not exacted any response. We haven't forced the Chinese to curtail their cyber behavior. The Russians have been heavily leveraged on gray and black market activity. For those of you that are familiar with cyberspace, you can go back and look at the activities of the now defunct, or at least rebranded, RBN, Russia Business Network, to find out exactly what I'm talking about. This functioned like a clearinghouse for the dark web before there was a dark web. And it was very effective in allowing Russia to exert influence over gray and black markets, but it didn't rise to the level of a nation-state threat, cyber threat. But we are now moving from the big two to the big three, because increasingly the consensus in the U.S. intelligence community is that the Iranians have expanded in both the level of their activity, but most importantly, in their level of sophistication in exploitation of cyberspace. It is still less sophisticated than Russia and China, but it is adaptive, and most importantly, it is politically dynamic. And I'll explain what that means in a second. In a nutshell, what we're talking about here is a newly constituted cyber actor that is more politically prone to act against perceived threats, right? And this is something that I think is enormously important in the context of the volatile political relationship that the United States now has with Iran. So, For those of you that haven't read it, I recommend it. This is an early assessment of Iranian cyber activities. It was carried out by a company called Cylance in 2014. It was called Operation Cleaver. By the way, the Iranians did not call their extended campaign that this report documented Operation Cleaver. The less than creative minds at Cylance themselves called it Operation Cleaver. Nonetheless, it's a good report, and it talks about the fact that the Iranians, since they peg it to 2012, but in reality it cycles back a little bit further than that, Iranian actors have directly attacked, established persistence in, and extracted highly sensitive materials from networks of government agencies and major critical infrastructure companies in the following countries, right? And there's the laundry list, and it extends far beyond the list of usual suspects. It's not just Saudi Arabia, it's not just Israel, it's not just the United States. The thing that the Cylance report alludes to only in passing, but it's worth mentioning here, is that the investigators for the company, when they were doing their research, found that a lot of the residual presence that Iran left in these networks that they mapped allowed them to have real-world effects. For example, unlocking previously locked gates at airports and influencing electronic control systems. Not that the Iranians were doing them now, but they were creating redundancies that would allow them to do it later, which goes back to the question of politics about what would be the conditions under which Iran would like to use these exploitations. So, dial it forward. This is this year's worldwide threat assessment from the U.S. intelligence community. And it's long. I urge all of you to read it. But the bottom line up front is that the Iranian campaign in cyberspace is continuing. It's expanding. It's increasingly sophisticated. And it is intended both for espionage and to build capacity for future attacks, right? Attempting to deploy cyber attack capabilities that would enable attacks against critical infrastructure in the U.S. and allied countries, if circumstances so arise. This is we'll come back to this at the end of the presentation, but this is, I think, one to watch for sure. So we have to understand where we are and where we're heading. We have to know where we've been. So there's really three things that we're talking about here. First of all, formative events. We have been at war, at cyber war with Iran for about a decade. And we haven't noticed, right? All of you remember Stuxnet, the very poorly concealed joint Israeli-American project to derail through non-kinetic means the Iranian nuclear program. Color me skeptical. Even at the time, I thought it was a little bit too facile to think that a bit of code could fundamentally derail a national nuclear effort. Nonetheless, that's where we were. That's where we went. For the Iranians, this was a casus belli. This was a clear shot across the bow in cyberspace. War had been joined. Even though, empirically, Stuxnet was really not effective at all, right? The conventional wisdom is that it did something. There was a study that was done in 2012, I believe, by RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute in the UK, and it said that at the height of its effectiveness, before Stuxnet was identified and the affected centrifuges were isolated and replaced, it had managed to take just 10% of all affected centrifuges offline, right? So Stuxnet had only a tactical effect, but it had a strategic impact in the way the Iranians thought about cyberspace. It signaled to Iran that a new theater of hostile operations had been activated against the Islamic Republic. And by the way, Stuxnet, it's the most famous one, but it's not the only one. If you will dial it forward, if you look at this slide, you'll notice there's been at least 5 other cyber attacks on Iran during the period of time between 2010 and 2012. And the one in particular that's really interesting is the last one, which some of you may not be able to see because of the way the screen is angled. It's Mahdi, which was a spring 2012 indigenously developed malware, right? Emphasis on the indigenously developed, because the Iranians have historically framed cyber warfare as something that someone external is doing to them, meaning the United States or Israel. But Mahdi demonstrates that there's certainly computer sophistication within the country, and that cyber warfare may actually become an element of Iranian resistance, the resistance of the Iranian opposition to the regime itself. That's something that virtually nobody talks about, but it's a sort of a really interesting nuance, particularly in light of the current political circumstances that we're looking at. In response to this campaign, the Iranians embarked on what could be called a national cyber warfare initiative, right? What you're looking at is ballooning budgets. In the wake of Stuxnet, the regime allocated $1 billion to build a national cyber defense and cyber offense program. Economies of scale being what they are, $1 billion for Americans doesn't sound like much, but for an Iranian regime with a much smaller economy that is currently languishing at that time under international sanctions, that's a big deal. And it's been reinforced every year since. Since 2013, when he was elected, Hassan Rouhani, the moderate, I use air quotes, right? Moderate Iranian president, has increased overall cybersecurity spending on an annual basis 12-fold on the part of the Iranian regime. And the numbers are a little fuzzy. It's very hard to get accurate numbers on the Iranian cyber budget, but the Iranian infrastructure for cyber warfare, cyber operations, is actually stovepiped. I'll show you the slide in a second. But just the piece of it that belongs to the Revolutionary Guards now runs in the dozens of millions of dollars every year. And there are all sorts of other silos from which Iranian cyber derives. So budgets expanded. You also had the creation of a new structure, right? So this is what I was talking about. And this is, by the way, a very juvenile attempt to map what the structure of Iranian cyber actually is. It's actually much more sophisticated than this, but this gives you an entry-level look at the different agencies that are involved and the length and the breadth of the national cyber mission, because as you can see, it's truly a national cyber mission. And then we have to talk about the third component. That is not what I wanted to do. I apologize. The third component, which is that Iranian cyber is essentially dual in nature. Iranian cyber is both inward-facing and outward-facing, and it's intended to accomplish a couple of things. It includes formal structures. The outward-facing part includes formal structures like the IRGC. It also includes hacktivists, an affiliated group like the Iranian Cyber Army and Ashiana and a number of others. But the policy internally is intended to ultimately control and constrain the interaction of the Iranian people with the world, which they see as an important component of their ability to stabilize the regime and also to eliminate domestic threats. Right, so let's talk about that for a second. In order to understand regime priorities, you have to think about what they saw in the summer of 2009. In the summer of 2009, millions of Iranians came out in the street in what became known as the Green Movement to protest the fraudulent re-election of Hassan Rouhani. I'm not Hassan Rouhani, Mahmoud Abbas. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. I'm getting my Democrats mixed up. Excuse me. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And the reason I say fraudulent re-election is because by some tallies, more than 100% of Iranian precincts reported on his re-election. Right? It sounds an awful lot like Chicago, where they vote early and often. Nonetheless, there was a clear sentiment on the part of the Iranians that the vote had been hijacked, that Ahmadinejad had been re-elected despite or reselected despite the will of the people, and it brought Iranians out in droves in what became a grassroots, very broad-based national protest. One that very heavily leveraged social media and the internet in order to connect, in order to talk to one another, in order to organize protests, in order to have activists tell each other where they should meet next, what the next protest would be about, when it would be. And the regime saw this. And the way to think about what happened in the weeks and months after the outbreak of the Green Movement, you could explain a lot by saying that the Iranian regime went online, followed the Green Movement online, and throttled the Iranian revolution there, the counter-revolution, right? Because that's what happened. The Iranian regime saw an incipient threat from this broad-based opposition and saw that it was heavily leveraged in the internet and traveled onto the internet and has stayed there since and imposed a series of very onerous restrictions. Everything from extensive filtering of content and manipulation of bandwidth within the Iranian regime to surveillance and control systems, by the way, which were provided courtesy of a small company called ZTE out of China. Huawei, the not quite private Chinese company that's intimately linked with the Chinese military, has also provided suppression technology for the Iranian regime. The US government has sanctioned it as a response. And a series of domestic regulations and oversight conditions. For example, restrictions on internet cafes, where in Iran, in Tehran, you now have to present a passport in order to use public Wi-Fi. And the reason for this is, I think, very simple. It's intimidation, right? Somebody can see your passport, they know who you are, you're not anonymous on the web, you will behave differently on the web. And that's precisely what the regime wants. And the latest development, most important development, is the dream of a halal internet, which is, oh, I have 5 minutes. I gotta go quick. The dream, so I won't do some of this stuff. But the thing that you should think about, 30 seconds. If the Chinese have the Great Firewall, if the Russian model of internet suppression is the wall of noise, right? The sort of so much incorrect or misleading news that you just tune out completely. What the Iranians have envisioned is actually more Orwellian. It's more insidious. Because what they're trying to build, and they haven't gotten very far along on this process yet, and we can talk in the Q&A, we can talk exactly how much they've done so far, but they're trying to build a second internet. So if you go on Google, when Google is not blocked in Beijing, right? If you go on Google in Beijing and you Google Tiananmen and democracy, you get the 404 page forbidden. You can't access it, right? The Chinese don't want you to read about it. If you do the same thing, Iran democracy in Tehran, the vision is that eventually what you'll do is you'll get search results back, but they will conform to the regime's official interpretation of what democracy means, right? This is a very 1984-esque project. It hasn't gotten very far off the ground, but it's worth noting nonetheless. And then we get to CNO, computer network operations, right? So this is the outward-facing part of Iranian cyber. Iran is extremely active in the domain of CNO, and the objective is deterrence and its demonstration. And there's a whole series of attacks that are listed here, which can be categorized under one of those two categories. For example, the February 2014 attack on the Sands Corporation in Las Vegas that's owned by Sheldon Adelson, you know, he of the Bomb Iran fame, right? The Iranians really don't like him. They sort of took it personally, and they decided to fundamentally disrupt the computer systems in his corporation. They did the same a couple of years prior to Saudi Aramco. They took 80,000 computers of Saudi Aramco offline for a period of about 6 weeks. And the idea here is to demonstrate what they can do. It's not to create lasting damage. It's to create a warning that says, if there is something disruptive, if something happens, if we get sanctioned more, if our rapprochement with the West begins to deteriorate, this is an ace that we have in our back pocket that we can leverage, right? And that's particularly important now, because Iranian CNO has been notoriously political in nature. If you notice, right, as you cycle forward in time, what's happening that's changing these attacks? The negotiations over the JCPOA is changing these attacks. So you see Iran transition from demonstration attacks to more data mining operations. You know, phishing schemes against State Department officials and the acquisition of information. Why? Well, because Iran is getting what it wants at the negotiating table. the JCPOA, and we can have this debate, we have had this debate at this conference many times over, but it affected a real change in Iranian cyber behavior because Iran was no longer forced to demonstrate that it could reach out and touch the international community with offensive cyber because it was getting what it wants. But there's a flip side to that coin, which is that if now we are truly in an era of renewed confrontation with Iran, we can fully expect that Iran will use cyberspace as a way to demonstrate its resolve, its hostility, and its capability to the United States and other powers. So this gets us to planning for the future. All right, so a few key takeaways that I think are important here. And this, again, is the worldwide threat assessment, right? And it encompasses essentially 6 things, right? Iran, first of all, is continuing to make gains in the sophistication of its cyber program and its cyber capabilities, both domestic repression and external operations. Iran views cyber as a legitimate and increasingly mature theater of conflict. Iran sees cyber as an adjunct to kinetic conflict. Right? And if you talk to folks in the U.S. government, in the U.S. intelligence community, in the U.S. military, they fully expect that future hostilities with Iran will include a cybernetic adjunct. Right? What this actually means is not necessarily Iranian cyber attacks on the U.S. homeland, although that may happen, but it means Iranian cyber activities that disrupt communications and connectivity among U.S. and allied forces, for example, in theater, here. Iran also sees cyber as a tool of economic warfare. A great thing, I'm not going to get into this for the purposes of time, but a great thing for you guys to look at is between 2010 and 2012, there was an extended series of hacks carried out by Iran on JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America and a number of other U.S. financial institutions, which took those institutions offline and compromised at least some of their data temporarily. And that was sort of fell in the category of demonstration attacks. You know, the Iranians saying, see, here's what we can do to manipulate economic data in cyberspace. FDD has a Center for Analysis of Financial Strategy, and one of their scholars is a good friend of mine, Samantha Ravitch, a former National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney, who has pioneered the term cyber-enabled economic warfare. And that's precisely what we're talking about here. The idea of being able to leverage and potentially blackmail political actors through the use of cyber to affect economic assets. Iran is willing to target infrastructure, and we've seen that through Iranian hacks on things like attempted hacks on American nuclear reactors, attempted hacks on New York dams, for example, which happened about 2 years ago. And Iran is definitely willing to use cyber to gather information. In fact, the recent most visible Iranian exploitation activity in cyberspace has involved trying to use spear phishing to get the social media credentials of officials and diplomats at the U.S. State Department for a very simple reason. They kind of want to know what's going on at the State Department, right? It's not a secret, right? American politics are a little bit chaotic, so they're kind of interested in finding out what's actually going on. All right, so this leads us to concluding thoughts, sort of, I think, specifically germane here. For Israel, this is a conversation that is, as you can see, mostly America-centric, but it's enormously important for Israel as well, right? Israel is a high-tech network power, and that makes it increasingly aware of the power of Iranian cyber, but I would caution that it also makes it increasingly vulnerable to Iranian cyber. So here's a nightmare scenario for you guys to chew on, right? Over the last week, in all of my meetings, I've heard again and again about the inevitability of the end of the campaign between wars. The fact that there is a cyclical nature to the conflict with Hezbollah, and that Iran's precision project in Lebanon may be a casus belli. Israel may be forced to act. It may not, but that is a real possibility. And so imagine, if you will, although it's not a pleasant thought, imagine a near future conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in which an Iranian cyber actor incapacitates Israel's ability to call up reserves because it shuts down the traffic grid in places like Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, right? And it enormously complicates the deployment of troops, the forward motion of reserves into theater, and it erodes Israeli military capabilities, right? This is a real threat. And I am positive that the Israeli government is taking steps to mitigate it, but it shouldn't discount it as a non-event. What this also means is that this is an intensely political theater of operations in a broader sense for Iran. As I said, the change that we saw in Iranian behavior in cyberspace between the start, 2010, 2011, and 2018, had a lot to do with the fact that Iran was actually getting what it wanted at the negotiating table. It received enormous direct and indirect economic dividends as a result of the JCPOA. And Iran's need to intimidate via various means, including through cyberspace, had declined as a result. We are now in an escalatory cycle once again with the Iranians. And that means that cyber, in a very real sense, is an active theater of operations, and it should be considered as such by the United States and by American allies. So I'll stop there. I'll take off my presenter hat, and we'll do some questions. Thank you, guys. Got more? Okay. Oh, all right, so there's a lot. So as I said, what I'd like to do, there are microphones on the table. I'm going to try to compact and consolidate some of the questions that we got. I'm grateful that we actually have a lot. Let me start with this. Because there's a lot of Americans here. I'm an American. Seth's an American, right? So we'll talk a little bit about U.S. policy, right? So we're seeing what I would say is a little bit of fluidity in American policy. And what I'm curious about is, and some of you all are as well, is how has maximum pressure affected Iran's capabilities in these various theaters, right? Seth, you talked about that already a little bit. But in places like Latin America, in places like Europe, and how does the converse affect it as well, right? There's news out today that the president is considering throwing Iran an economic lifeline, offering them a $15 billion line of credit in line with the French proposal if they only come to the negotiating table or agree to come to the negotiating table ahead of the General Assembly meeting in New York at the end of the month. So how does a restrictive environment change how they operate? How does a permissive environment change how they operate? So I'll leave it to all of you. You want to grab it? Nobody, huh? All right, go ahead.
It seems like, again, the change in American policy, I think it can be ascribed to two factors that are not mutually exclusive. One is President Trump does what President Trump does, and he does Trump. And that's not, that's a given. But the other thing is that President Trump usually tends to offer what he sees as the practical, palatable choice. And if he thinks that continuing escalation against Iran, he's considering the option of changing policy on Iran, he doesn't think that because he suddenly loves Iran. He thinks that because the previous policy has become a burden. A burden domestically, politically, also a burden in terms of his stance vis-a-vis the world. So I think the most urgent thing about this potential change, and particularly a sea change, is that it comes about from what I think President Trump would define as commonsensical logic. And if it's now common sense that it's better to stop the escalation against Iran than to take the initiative on engaging Iran, that says something about the state of the world. It says something about the Israeli position, which goes against Iran at all costs, at all times. And that position could potentially be more a burden than an asset at the moment in the United States.
Yeah, sure. I'll take a stab at this. two points. One is, this is not a political comment, just I think a factual one, that the efforts to negotiate deals with a range of actors right now, North Korea, the Taliban, which just collapsed over the weekend, and then even Iran, the administration's effort, including the president's, have not been particularly successful so far on any of these fronts. So hoping we get any kind of a deal with Iran based on the past 2.5 years, we'll see. My expectations are low. I mean, I think I'll go back to what several people have talked about on this panel about realpolitik. And I think at the core of the challenge is, I think as long as Iran's security interests are different, and they will remain different from the Israelis and Western countries, there will be competition. So I don't expect to see maximum pressure significantly. I mean, I find most of the 12 steps that the U.S. Secretary of State outlined as being non-negotiable for the Iranians. Many of them, not all of them. Missile program, I just don't think this is their primary, primary asymmetric capability in reaching a number of organizations along with the IRGC Quds Force. I'm not optimistic that negotiations are going to significantly decrease Iran's interest in doing it. We may be able to change some things along the margins. Certainly, it's impacted Iran's economy. There are protests that continue to rage, hundreds per month if you're counting small truckers and others. But I'm just not convinced at this point maximum pressure is likely to change the strategic interests of Iran, in part because this is what competition is. There were 4 or 5 decades worth of this kind of activity during the Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The U.S. got lucky that the Soviet Union collapsed. So
by the way, projecting numbers showing that the protests have decreased significantly.
they're still pretty large. I mean, we've just looked at the numbers over the last 2 years to the end of August, and there's something like 3,500 protests, including even a lot in August. But not enough to overthrow the regime. They're decentralized. The RGC is still pretty competent and actually hasn't been called into almost any of these. So I think in that sense, one could overstate. So my point here is that I think the maximum pressure campaign may have some ability to impact some aspects of Iranian behavior, but at the end of the day, competition is going to continue, and we should expect that.
May I just add a point? I think that the problem with the question is that there hasn't been maximum pressure. The only maximum pressure campaign that is worth calling that way is a campaign where sanctions, are able to create the sense inside the regime that the stability and survival of the regime is at stake because the impact of sanctions is causing unhappiness in the country. And it may be the case that that's what moved the regime to negotiate in 2012, 2013, maybe. And in order to get that, there has to be an equally credible threat of military action and or pressure for regime change. Now, whether those two policies can be enacted, whether that threat can be made credible is a whole separate issue. But right now, the regime in Tehran does not see, and that's because we are telling them that there is no credible military option, and we're telling them that we are not interested in supporting regime change, and we are putting together a sanction strategy that is far from being the maximum economic pressure that those two parallel tracks should support. So I don't see how we can even discuss this, frankly.
And also?
Yeah.
Just a quick thought about, so I don't think that, you know, based on whether there's going to be maximum pressure applied or not, that the Iranian proxy strategy is going to change, you know, significantly over the next couple of months. I think it has been pretty coherent over the last couple of years, and it has increased, and I think it will continue to increase. And one of the reasons for that is that simply it's for Iran, it's much easier to actually have a long-term coherent strategy. I mean, of course, there's also elections, but it doesn't really matter who's the president in Iran, because he's not deciding what's going to happen on the ground. Whereas in the US, we have seen that within 4 years, you know, there can be a lot of really compelling policy changes compared to the administration that, you know, was in charge before. So I think this is also something that we have to consider.
Just on Iran, I disagree, Michel. I don't think it doesn't matter who's president in Iran. I don't think it doesn't matter what the Iranian public says. I think one of the reasons that the protests don't cohere is because Iran has a record of popular revolutions. In 1979, one was the fourth one in less than 100 years, and all of them occur when a popular coalition forms. So I think any Iranian leader worth his salt, dictatorial as he may be, has to be aware of the public. And I think what you call the proxy strategy will continue, not as a means for advancing a master plan, so much as that's how Iran does its business. You know, that the proxy policy is Iranian presence in the Middle East.
I just want to come back to the sanctions issue. Here's my concern with sanctions, and this is not to say I disagree with using sanctions as a tool, and I certainly agree that this is not maximum pressure. But I think if anybody here has spent time looking at the sanctions literature in political science and the international political economy, sanctions have severe limitations in changing the behavior, particularly if you look at the Dresner work, for example, of adversaries. And so I guess the broader issue is how much hope should we have that using economic sanctions as a tool to help change behavior, how much hope should we put in this when the track record of sanctions and changing behavior is actually quite poor? In fact, if you look at the paperwork in international security, I mean, his argument was pretty straightforward in looking at it. Sanctions do not work for those purposes.
All right, we could do this all day, so let's not talk American policy. But I did have, I'm paraphrasing, but we had a question from the audience. I think it's directed to you, Emmanuel, and to you, Michel, about the intrinsic fluidity of what we're seeing in these various theaters. That, you know, both the interoperability of activities of money laundering, financing, the transit of individuals, and also how similar the models are. Can you just spend a minute talking about what you're seeing, how much cross-pollination there is between Iranian and Hezbollah activities in various theaters? And also, Yaniv, because you haven't.
Okay. I mean, I can speak mostly about Latin America. The one interesting cross-pollination I've seen, and that it is continuing, is that Iran has, since the early 1980s, launched a global program of exporting the revolution, which it does through the establishment of not just the establishment of cultural center and religious institutions that supposedly serve the Shia diaspora around the world, but that it actually pursues the conversion of non-Muslims to Shia Islam. Okay, and it's not just a pet project of some crazy cleric out in a seminary. Okay, this is endorsed by the state. It is run in a centralized fashion from a seminary in Qom, which is called the Al-Mustafa International University. It has 3,500 teachers. It has publications in dozens of languages, websites, programs. It trains clerics who are converts all over the world. You know, you know, if anyone's interested, I can send you a video where they interview one of the people who runs the program in Latin America, who so proudly says that there is a guy who he converted from Cuba who's studying in QOM, and his son is a 13-year-old in a madrasa training to be a cleric. He will be the first Ayatollah in Havana, okay? So this is what they're doing. They're spending money, they're investing significantly, very patiently. It's a long-term project of expanding their influence through the recruitment of converts across the globe. It's done by language, then the converts are brought to Iran, 2 months trips, on buses, they get taken to battlefields, to holy places. They're mixed up by language so that they can connect across borders. It's not just, the Peruvians coming and the Brazilians coming together. They come as a Pan-American operation, and they connect through social media, they stay in touch, they have chat groups, and this project expands. The clerics come back. They live in their own countries and expand and spread this message over the course of time. They establish their own mosques and cultural center, and then this system sustains itself. Now, why?
Kind of sounds like Birthright.
Yeah, except that Birthright promotes values that are slightly different, although maybe you don't see the difference there. Yeah. Now, the point here is that when you look at these networks, which are made of, in Latin America, Latin American Christian converts to Shia Islam, and Latin American born Iranian trained clerics, they cross-pollinate with the local Shia expatriate communities of Lebanese. All of the Lebanese men who are in the tri-border area married to Paraguayan, Brazilian, or Argentinian women, and usually doesn't happen the other way around. It's men from Lebanon marrying women from the tri-border area, not men from the tri-border area marrying Lebanese women. The local women convert to Islam. Where do they convert? They don't convert in the local mosque. They don't convert with the cleric at the mosque of the village where their husband comes from in Lebanon. They convert with the network set up by the Iranian. They use the literature produced by the Iranian network, which, by the way, in Latin America is supervised by Mohsen Rabbani, the former cultural attaché to the Iranian embassy in Buenos Aires, who is one of the masterminds behind the AMIA bombing. So that is one area where you see significant interaction, cross-pollination, and the Iranians are, wherever there are Shia Lebanese communities, the Iranians take the back seat. But wherever that presence is not big enough, it is the Iranians who take the front seat and engage in propaganda activities, the establishment of centers, the outreach, the attempt to convert influencers in local societies, all of which is, of course, geared towards supporting these activities, both commercial and otherwise, protecting their agents, advancing their political interests, and gathering additional supporters.
I'd like to take it a step further or jump into what Emmanuel just said and explain the method. To give another example to what we've seen, there is the Quds Parade every year in several main cities in Europe. And we've monitored this Quds Parade for a few years now. This year particularly, we actually did a significant job to see how the centers are preparing themselves, how they bring the community, how they recruit the buses, when they come, where they come out of, and so on and so forth, mainly online. And what you saw is very interesting. There is a new, I should have presented that clip. There is a new song of Hezbollah. People are singing it in Lebanon. I would say it's a new anthem of Hezbollah, and you saw it all over in some significant portions of the Quds Parade. This song was being sang by people that took part in those marches through social media, through Word Without Borders, through the strong connectivity that these communities has with Iran, the indoctrination, the material, the songs, I would say images and so on, are coming very fast to those communities, and it influences. I would say that in some cases, just one word about the birthright comment that you've made, Ori. I think that in many cases, it's good that a country communicates with its diaspora. The question is whether at the end of the day or at the end game would be to have the diaspora serving non-legitimate purposes. And with Iran, we saw more than a few examples of that. That's for me.
Yeah, you know, it's great that you mentioned the Al-Quds march, because one really funny thing that I think I saw this year is that the one in Baghdad was actually much smaller than the one in Berlin. So I would say that, no, it's not so. I think it was maybe 20 guys or something, and one pro-Iranian militia that set this up in Baghdad and in Berlin. I'm very familiar with the marches there, so that's over like that's several hundred people every year. So what I'm going to say is that I think this, you know, convergence of these different factors that we were talking about right now is, you know, it really depends on the Middle East where we're looking at. I think in Lebanon, I mean, it's very obvious, and Iran has heavily invested. You know, they have set up social services. I know that Iran at the very, you know, where the very early years of Hezbollah, they have even donated tractors to Shia farmers in Lebanon. Of course, they used to have very huge dawah efforts, etc. To be honest, I don't know exactly what's the situation right now, because also the Hezbollah has taken a very interesting approach to all of that in recent years. But anyway, I think in other places in the Middle East, such as Iraq, or even more so, this you know, these efforts, if they happen at all, happen on a much smaller scale. And I know that, for example, Iran also, they used to bring Iraqi, you know, Shia militia guys, as well as some Houthis. They used to bring them to Iran for religious training. And from what I heard, that these guys weren't really that interested in the religious training. They wanted to learn how to fight, and they weren't that much interested in Iranian indoctrination.
Perfect. So we have a couple of more from this round, and then I'll open it up if we have time. This is a question, I think, for Seth and for Michelle and, well, frankly, anybody who wants to jump in, but primarily for you two, because it relates to hybrid warfare strategy, right? So the discussion of the proxy network, and also, frankly, the discussion of Iranian proxy activities in Latin America and in Europe has for the Iranians, the benefit of playing on the weaknesses of countervailing strategy on the part of the United States and on the part of American allies. The question asks about our lackluster efforts in countering money laundering, criminal activities, etc. Why are we so weak in these domains? And is there anything that we can do to tighten things up in a way that would adversely impact Iran's regional posture?
Sure. I mean, I'll speak of this from the U.S. side on strategies. I mean, here's I think the challenge. If one looks at the U.S.'s national defense strategy, the primary focus, and if you look at the spending, the R&D that the U.S. is spending in the foreseeable future, it is geared towards strategic competition with the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians, and it is geared primarily towards, and look at the funding, and this is true just as much at AT&L and the Pentagon as it is with DARPA, so the sort of the future Department of Defense research on conventional and nuclear competition. The war games, many of which I've participated in, are generally focused on conventional war. I don't think the U.S. is adequately preparing for competition at this level. If you're going to compete at this level with these kinds of organizations, including the Quds Force, this is primarily operating by, with, and through partner forces, proxies. It's a dirty game. It's one that the U.S. certainly did in the Cold War in Latin America, not always well, and certainly wasn't cleanly, and it made mistakes in Nicaragua running a campaign around the U.S. Congress. But I think it's the funding for these kinds of activities has declined. State Department's budget's in decline. There's no U.S. information agency, so the information warfare component, I think, has declined. I think if you really want a serious strategy to deal at this level, you've got to start focusing on upping your resources on psychological operations, information campaigns, including public diplomacy, your special operations and intelligence units. This is not the direction, in my view, the U.S. has gone.
Yeah, you know, I really don't want to hand out any policy prescription. As I mentioned before, I'm the neutral person on this panel, but I totally agree with what you just said, and I think this is what I was talking about when I mentioned denial operations. If we talk about denial operations, they don't have to be kinetic strikes. They can be information operations, such as you just mentioned, or they could, you know, even I don't know, creating like a border regime at the border between Iraq and Syria might also help. You know, you were talking about the land bridge, so if you have a border regime there that you know monitors very clearly what goes through and what doesn't go through, I think that could immensely help.
I may just word on sort of the Latin America and you mentioned money laundering, drug trafficking. I think you know there's several problems there that I don't think U.S. can afford to ignore, but they're very difficult to confront. One is that, of course, you know, most of these cases arise in foreign jurisdictions, and the U.S. simply doesn't have the tool to successfully prosecute them, right? I mean, maybe 1 in 10 or 20 cases involving, you know, drug trafficking and money laundering for Hezbollah will have a U.S. angle, whereby the you know, U.S. authorities can actually indict people overseas and then launch a successful extradition effort. Most of the other times you have to rely on the willingness of local authorities to actually, you know, prosecute these cases on their own, and you know, outside of the Western world there's much to be desired because systems are weak, they're exposed to corruption, etc., etc., etc. But the second problem, and there I think the U.S. can do something more, is that the strategy, whether it's on the sanctions level or on the prosecution level, has always been to, what is the expression in American English, kill the chicken to scare the monkeys, right? So you go to, you know, you say, well, you know, there's 300 you know, used car dealers in America that are laundering money for Hezbollah in the Lebanese-Canadian bank scheme, and we're going to do a civil forfeiture action against 30 of them, because they're the most pernicious one, or because the FBI said that we can go after those 30 but not the other ones, right? And they'll lose their business, and that'll scare everybody else to, you know, into stupor, and they will stop doing their terrible things. Well, guess what? They don't. You know, we catch, you know, one kingpin in Panama and dismantle his businesses and put one of the family members on trial, and this is the Wackett family, and the guy got 27 months for money laundering cocaine proceeds for the cartels. Do you think that a guy who laundered billions of dollars for the cartels spends 27 months in a jail in Miami, that is going to dissuade people from money laundering for drug cartels, let alone those who do it for ideological purposes? The answer is no. What the US needs to do in these cases is the opposite. It is kill all the monkeys and then roast the chicken and eat it, in the sense that unless you go after these networks in a very comprehensive fashion, and you take people down and you make them pay a very heavy price, these networks will continue to operate. I mean, it's like the war on drugs. We catch anywhere between 5 to 10% of cocaine smuggling globally. 90% goes through. So instead of scaring anyone, that 5 to 10% is actually factored into the cost of the business model by the cartels. And unless you change something in that model, for example, when it comes to drugs, unless you start addressing the demand, right? The fact that there are so many people who are so respectable who are buying cocaine for their Saturday night entertainment, unless you address that as well and you create these incentives for people in our societies to partake in these schemes, you're not going to achieve anything.
So You know what the most profound thing that I drew from your analogy is that it's almost lunchtime. So I'm kind of hungry. So last question, and Ori, it's all about you. You may be surprised to know that your presentation elicited some response from the audience. I'm going to try to condense it as constructively as I can. There, sort of a twofold question for you, and all I ask is sort of a succinct answer, because you're going to be the one standing between us and lunch. So I worry about the forks. So
It's the knife.
it's knives. The first question is I think you made a very compelling case about the Iranians thinking that the best defense is a good offense, and a lot of what they're doing internationally has to do with their perceptions of internal weakness and their perceptions of isolation. But is it not possible to be both? Meaning, is it not possible to be defensive but also to have big plans and grand global ambitions? And along those lines, it seems like massive cash infusions from a cash-strapped country in a vanity project like the nuclear program would suggest the latter rather than the former. And then, if you can, because you were the expert on the evolution of Shia Islam, what's coming next, right? Because the supreme leader is sick, he's infirm, he's going to leave the political stage. The campaign for succession is also coming up. Is it going to be continuity, or is it going to be change?
Cool. I'll be very brief. Yes, definitely. You can do both. I mean, the fact that the defense and offense are related, certainly in Iranian eyes, I have to say, again, it seems to me like from listening to the analyses that we heard today, it seems to me like most of the Iranian funds are reinvested into the Iranian operation. And the Iranian operation means to survive, means to sustain itself. It grows, definitely. There are economic benefits that need to be reaped. And there are attempts constantly. There are also fringes. There are attempts to perhaps expand ideology and so on and so forth. I don't think they're very successful. That goes directly to the second question. The supreme leader is infirm. We had, Assad Senior syndrome, waited for him to die for God knows how many years. I don't know how quickly the supreme leader will grace us with his absence. But I think the supreme leader is actually demonstrating where his mind is. I think he is at heart a revolutionary. I think he would like to see a defiant Islamic Republic. But I think it seems to me he understands that that is not his best hope, domestically, more so perhaps than vis-a-vis the world. I think the Iranian public has demonstrated very concisely that the conservative cause is, as far as most of them are concerned, a lost cause. Now, I think Revolutionary Guards could perhaps take the country by storm, but I think that would inspire the sort of coalition, popular revolution that we talked about. I think the conservatives, the revolutionaries, are fighting an uphill battle. I think the supreme leader is also at heart a pragmatist. I think he wants to leave a functional Islamic Republic behind him. And sanctions notwithstanding, the Islamic Republic at the moment is as strong as it has ever been. And so I think he could have hindered Rouhani significantly. He could have harmed his efforts. He has done so to former presidents. The fact that he hasn't done so far, to me, says that he understands the Islamic Republic to be in the mode of Rouhani, and that he would not object strenuously to having Rouhani or somebody like Rouhani replace him as supreme leader.
Well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, we are done. I'm delighted to say this has been one of the most informative and dynamic panels that I've ever chaired, that I've ever participated on. I hope you guys feel the same way. If you want to throw vegetables or ask questions, feel free to come up. And please join me in thanking my panelists.